The wind did not simply blow through the valley of Red Hollow. It scoured it. It was a relentless, invisible hand that sanded the paint from the false front buildings and drove grit into the deepest creases of a man's skin. To the west, the sagebrush plains rolled out like a gray ocean frozen in turmoil, broken only by the jagged, rocky ridges that jutted up like the spines of buried prehistoric beasts. To the east lay the town, a cluster of raw timber and ambition huddling against the vastness of the territory. Above it all, the sky stretched wide and unforgiving, a pale, bleached blue that offered no shade and very little mercy. It was in this hard country, on a marginal scrap of land 3 miles from the town center, that Ellen Ward waged her daily war against the elements. The morning sun was already warm, promising a blistering afternoon. As Ellen walked the footpath from the creek back to her cabin, the buckets in her hands were heavy, the water sloshing against the tin sides with a rhythmic thud that matched her stride. She had made this trip 4 times already since dawn. The creek was running low, a sluggish vein of brown water struggling through the mud, and she had to walk further upstream each week just to find a pool deep enough to dip her pail. She set the buckets down on the hard-packed earth near the door to catch her breath. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a faint streak of dust. Ellen was 24 years old, though the sun and the wind had begun to etch fine lines at the corners of her eyes, making her look older, or perhaps just harder. She wore a faded calico dress that had been mended so many times the original pattern was a memory, covered by a stained apron. Her hands were not the soft, white hands of the ladies in the town magazines. They were calloused, the nails short and often broken, stained with the soil she fought to cultivate. She looked up at her cabin. It was a sturdy, humble thing, built of rough-hewn logs she and her father had cut themselves 5 years ago. The roof was sagging on the west side, and she knew the next heavy rain would bring water dripping onto the table. But it was hers. It stood against the horizon with a stubborn sort of pride. Ellen picked up the buckets and hauled them inside. The interior was sparse but meticulously clean. A scrubbed pine table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and a cast-iron stove that demanded constant feeding. On the far wall, a single shelf held her greatest treasures: 6 books, their spines worn and lettering faded, a volume of poetry, a history of Rome, a Bible, and 3 novels. They were the last remnants of the life her father had promised her, a life of learning and gentility that had died along with him 2 winters ago. She poured the water into the barrel and went back outside to the wood pile. The axe handle was smooth and familiar in her grip. She swung it with practiced efficiency, the blade biting into the dry pine with a sharp crack. Each blow was a release of tension, a way to speak back to the silence that surrounded her. She lived in the silence, but she did not live in peace. Later that morning, Ellen hitched her mare, Bess, to the small wagon. It was time to go into Red Hollow for supplies. She dreaded these trips. The 3-mile ride was peaceful enough, with the meadowlarks singing from the fence posts and the smell of sage sharp in the heat. But the town itself was a gauntlet she had to run. Red Hollow was growing. New frames were going up every month, and the sound of hammers and saws was the town's heartbeat. But as Ellen guided Bess down the single, dust-choked Main Street, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations paused on the boardwalks. Eyes followed her. They were not eyes of welcome. She pulled the wagon up in front of the butcher shop and tied the reins. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed her apron and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of sawdust and raw meat. Mr. Halloway, the butcher, was wiping his hands on a blood-stained rag. He was a thick-set man with a face that flushed red easily. He did not smile when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Ward," he said, his tone flat. "Good morning, Mr. Halloway," Ellen replied, keeping her voice steady. "I need 3 pounds of salt pork and a side of bacon." Halloway moved slowly, slapping the meat onto the scale with unnecessary force. He wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with string. "That'll be 80 cents. Ellen paused, her hand halfway to the coins in her pocket. 80? It was 65 last week. "The sign in the window says 20 cents a pound for the pork," Holloway stared at her, his eyes hard and unblinking. Price went up. Supply is tight. Take it or leave it. Ellen felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She knew it was a lie. She had seen Mrs. Miller walk out 5 minutes ago with a basket full of meat, laughing about the bargain she had struck. But Ellen also knew that arguing would only give him a story to tell at the saloon later, how the wild ward woman had made a scene. She placed the coins on the counter, counting them out carefully. 80 cents, she said quietly. Pleasure doing business. Holloway grunted, sweeping the money into his drawer without looking at her. Ellen took her parcel and walked out, her chin held high. She could feel his gaze on her back. She crossed the street to the Mercantile. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, a stark contrast to the tension that knotted her stomach. 2 women stood by the bolt fabric, fingering a roll of blue gingham. One was the pastor's wife, Mrs. Crow, a woman whose piety was worn like armor. As Ellen entered, the conversation stopped abruptly. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, before Mrs. Crow leaned in to whisper something to her companion. The other woman's eyes darted to Ellen, wide with scandalized delight, before she hid a smile behind her hand. Ellen walked past them, focusing her eyes on the shelves of canned goods. She could hear the whispers as clearly as if they were shouting. "Living out there all alone," the voice murmured. "It is not natural. They say she has visitors at night." "I heard it was Indians," the other voice hissed back. "Pagan savages. That is why she refuses to sell the land. She is turning wild herself." Ellen's grip on her basket tightened until her knuckles turned white. It was all lies. She had no visitors. She had befriended a Shoshone family the previous winter, trading a sack of potatoes for dried venison when the snows were deep. But that was survival, not scandal, to these women. However, a woman without a husband was a threat, and a woman who held land was an affront to the natural order. She reached for a sack of flour on a high shelf. Her hands were shaking with suppressed anger, and her fingers slipped. The heavy burlap sack tumbled from her grasp, plummeting toward the floor where it would surely burst and spill white dust over her worn boots, giving the women one more thing to mock, but the sack never hit the floor. A hand shot out, large, tanned, and scarred, and caught the sack inches from the ground. The movement was a blur, too fast to follow. Ellen gasped and stepped back. The man straightened up, holding the flour easily in one hand. He was tall, with shoulders that filled out his dust-coated canvas jacket. His hat was pulled low, brim battered and sweat-stained, shadowing a face that was dark from the sun and heritage. High cheekbones and a strong jaw hinted at Spanish blood, and a thin white scar cut through his left eyebrow. He looked at her, and for a moment, the bustling store faded. His eyes were dark, almost black, but there was no mockery in them. There was only a quiet, steady assessment. "Careful there, miss," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder in a canyon. He held the sack out to her. Ellen reached for it, and for a second, her hand brushed against his. His skin was rough, warm, and calloused like hers. A strange jolt went through her, a spark of static electricity that seemed to jump from his fingers to her wrist. She pulled her hand back quickly, clutching the sack to her chest. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice sounding breathless to her own ears. The man did not crowd her. He took a respectful step back, giving her space, a courtesy she was not used to receiving in Red Hollow. He moved with a slight shift of weight to his right side, favoring his left leg as if an old pain resided there. "It is too heavy a burden to carry alone," he said. He wasn't talking about the flour. The look in his eyes suggested he saw the weight of the whispers, the staring women, the hostility of the room. Before Ellen could reply, the spell was broken by the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Crow. "Well," the pastor's wife said loudly, "I suppose like attracts like." The man turned his head slowly to look at the women. He said nothing, just held them with that dark, unblinking gaze until they flustered and turned back to the fabric, their whispers now frantic and indignant. He tipped his hat to Ellen, a small, polite gesture, and turned to the counter to buy a pouch of tobacco. Ellen paid for her flour quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and hurried out to the wagon. She did not look back, but as she loaded her supplies, she saw him emerge from the store. He walked with a distinctive, rolling gait, that limp visible now that she knew to look for it. He swung himself onto a large bay horse with the ease of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on his feet. He was James Cortez. She had heard the name spoken by the men at the livery, usually with a sneer attached to it. A drifter, a half-breed, a man who worked hard and said little. Ellen climbed onto her wagon seat, her hands trembling as she took the reins. She told herself it was just the adrenaline of the near accident. Jamie Cortez rode the bay horse down the center of the street, heading for the saloon to wash the trail dust from his throat. He had just finished a 3-month drive, bringing cattle up from the southern basin for the Double Bar Ranch. His muscles ached. His left leg throbbed with the dull, familiar agony of a brake that had never set right, and his pockets held 3 months of pay. He tied the bay to the hitching rail and patted the animal's neck. "Easy, boy. We will get you some grain in a minute." As he stepped onto the boardwalk, the saloon doors swung open. A group of men spilled out, laughter loud and raucous. In the center of them stood a man who commanded the space like a king in his own court. Silas Crow was a tall man, broad in the chest, wearing a black frock coat that made him look like a preacher, though the dust on his boots and the gun on his hip marked him as a rancher. He had a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness that lived in his pale blue eyes. He held a Bible in one hand and a glass of whiskey in the other, a contradiction that seemed to bother no one in Red Hollow. Jamie stopped. He felt his stomach tighten, a cold knot of recognition forming in his gut. He had not seen Silas Crow in 5 years, not since a dark night on a ranch near the border. But the man had not changed. He still wore his righteousness like a weapon. Silas stopped mid-laugh. His eyes found Jamie, and the smile died on his lips, replaced by a look of sharp, predatory interest. Well, Silas said, his voice carrying over the noise of the street. "Look what the wind blew in. If it isn't the mongrel pup, all grown up." The men around Silas quieted, sensing the sudden tension. They fanned out slightly, forming a loose semicircle. Jamie kept his face impassive. He kept his hands away from his hips, letting them hang loose at his sides. "Crow," he said, a simple acknowledgement. "I heard you were riding for the Double Bar," Silas said, stepping down from the boardwalk so he stood on the dirt street, level with Jamie. "I told the foreman he was taking a risk. You have a history of biting the hand that feeds you, don't you, boy?" "I did my job," Jamie said calmly. "The cattle are delivered. My business is done." "Your business," Silas sneered. He took a step closer, invading Jamie's space. "Your business is trouble. I remember you. I remember how you questioned your betters, how you thought you could stand in the way of justice." Jamie remembered too. He remembered a terrified Mexican stable boy accused of stealing a saddle. He remembered stepping between the boy and Silas's whip. He remembered the darkness that followed, the boots striking his ribs, the crushing weight of men holding him down while Silas directed the punishment. The limp he walked with today was a souvenir from Silas Crow's version of justice. "I remember a man who beat a child," Jamie said softly. The words were quiet, but in the hush of the street, they landed like stones. Silas's face darkened. A vein pulsed in his temple. "You watch your tongue. This is a God-fearing town. We do not take kindly to drifters spreading lies. You are a blight, Cortez. You and your kind. You drift in here, corrupting good people, thinking you have a place." He looked around at the crowd, raising his voice to a preaching cadence. "The scripture tells us to separate the wheat from the chaff, to cast out the unclean thing from our midst, lest it rot the whole harvest." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. Men nodded, their eyes shifting from Silas to Jamie with growing hostility. From the corner of his eye, Jamie saw a wagon pause near the livery stable. He saw the woman from the mercantile, Ellen Ward, sitting on the bench seat. She was watching, her face pale. She was witnessing this, seeing him stripped down by this man's words. Shame burned in Jamie's chest, hot and fierce, not for himself, but that she had to see it. "I'm just passing through. Crow," Jamie said, his voice steel. "Unless you are looking to start a war in the middle of the street." Silas laughed, but it was a dry, humorless sound. He hooked his thumbs in his belt near his holster. "You are not worth the bullet, boy. But take a warning. The sun sets early for men like you in Red Hollow. Best be riding on." "When I am ready," Jamie said. He turned his back on Silas, a dangerous move, a calculated insult, and walked past him toward the livery stable. He could feel Silas's eyes boring into his spine. He expected a shot or a shout, but there was only the sound of Silas spitting into the dirt. As Jamie passed the wagon, he did not look up at Ellen. He could not bear to see the pity or the fear in her eyes. He kept walking, his limp more pronounced as his legs stiffened with rage. Ellen watched him go. She sat frozen on the wagon seat, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had heard every word. She had seen the way the townspeople, the men who bought supplies at the store, the men who sat in church pews on Sunday, had nodded along with Silas. They had looked at Jamie Cortez not as a man, but as a thing to be removed. A flicker of recognition sparked in her chest. It was a cold, lonely feeling. She looked at Silas Crow. He was laughing now, clapping a man on the shoulder, resuming his role as the town's patriarch. But Ellen remembered a Sunday service 2 months ago. Silas was a lay preacher, often filling the pulpit when the circuit minister was away. He had preached on purity that day. He had spoken of the harlot in the wilderness and the dangers of unmonitored women. He had not used her name, but he had looked straight at her, his blue eyes piercing, until the back of her neck burned and the congregation shifted in their seats to glance at her. He hated Jamie because Jamie was different. He hated Ellen because she was independent. To a man like Silas Crow, difference was a sin, and independence was rebellion. She snapped the reins, urging Bess forward. "Giddy up," she whispered. She needed to get out of this town. The air here felt thick, choking her. As she rode out of Red Hollow, the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. The road home was empty, winding through the sagebrush. Usually, the vastness of the prairie comforted her, but tonight the shadows stretched long and thin, like grasping fingers. She had the distinct sensation of being watched. Ellen turned in her seat, scanning the ridge lines to the south against the darkening sky. She saw silhouettes, 3 riders. They were too far away to identify, just black shapes cut out of the twilight. They were not moving along the road. They were sitting still on the crest of the hill, watching the trail, watching her. A shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the evening chill. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Just cowboys," she told herself aloud. Just checking the fence lines. But fence lines didn't need checking at dusk. And cowboys didn't sit still like statues while a lone woman rode by. She slapped the reins harder. "Come on, Bess, home!" The wagon rattled and bounced over the ruts. Ellen kept her eyes forward, fixed on the distant dark shape of her cabin. But her mind was spinning. The look in Silas's eyes, the anger in Jamie Cortez's voice, the whispers in the mercantile. The world felt like it was tightening around her, a noose slowly drawing shut. By the time she reached the cabin, night had fully fallen. She unhitched Bess with fumbling hands, leading the mare into the small lean-to barn and forking extra hay for her. She barred the barn door, something she rarely did, and hurried to the cabin. Once inside, she dropped the bar across the main door. The heavy thud of the wood falling into place usually made her feel safe. Tonight, it sounded like the lid of a coffin closing. She lit the kerosene lantern on the table. The golden light pushed back the shadows, revealing the familiar comfort of her home. She unpacked the flour and the salt pork, her movements mechanical. Finally, she stopped. She walked to the corner of the room where her father's old rocking chair sat empty. Beside it was a small wooden box. Ellen knelt and opened the lid. Inside lay the fragments of her history, a bundle of letters her father had written to her mother during the war, tied with a blue ribbon, a worn leather Bible with the family tree written on the flyleaf, a small silver brooch with a lock of her mother's hair woven into the glass. She picked up the brooch, turning it over in her hands. It was cool to the touch. These things were all she had left of the people who had loved her. They were the proof that she belonged to someone, that she came from somewhere. "I am tired. Papa," she whispered to the empty room. "I am so tired." She looked at the lantern flame, watching it dance and flicker. She imagined a life where she didn't have to bar the door, a life where she could walk into town and be greeted with smiles instead of suspicion, a life where she wasn't so bone-deep lonely that the accidental touch of a stranger's hand in a store felt like a lightning strike. She closed the box and stood up. She felt a fierce, stubborn pride welling up beneath the exhaustion. She had built this life. She had held this land. She would not let them scare her away. But as she blew out the lantern and lay down in the dark, she kept her father's old shotgun leaning against the wall by her bed, 3 miles away, on the far side of the creek where the town's jurisdiction faded into the open range. Jamie Cortez made his camp. He did not stay in the boarding house. He preferred the ground. Walls made him feel trapped. And in Red Hollow, walls had ears. He had laid his bedroll out in a small depression of earth shielded by a stand of twisted juniper. His small campfire had burned down to red coals, offering little light but a steady warmth. The sky above was a riot of stars, the Milky Way a smeared path of diamond dust across the black. Jamie lay on his back, his hands folded behind his head. The pain in his leg had settled into a dull ache. He stared up at the vastness, but he did not see the stars. He saw the woman, Ellen Ward. He saw the way she had stood in the mercantile, her back straight as a ramrod despite the venom those hens were spitting at her. He saw the fraying on her cuffs and the callus on her palm when she took the flour. She was struggling. That much was clear. She was poor, and she was alone, and the town was trying to grind her down into dust. Most people broke under that kind of pressure. They packed up and left, or they bowed their heads and accepted their place at the bottom. She had not bowed. He felt a stirring in his chest, a strange warmth that he hadn't felt in years. It was admiration. Yes, but something else too, a kinship. He rolled over, staring into the dying embers. Then his mind drifted to the encounter outside the saloon. Silas Crow. The memory of the beating came unbidden, sharp and visceral. The smell of horse manure and blood, the grit in his mouth, the sound of Silas's voice, calm and righteous, giving orders to the men who kicked him. Teach him his place, break the spirit, and the body follows. They had broken his leg. They had not broken his spirit. Jamie sat up, reaching for a stick to poke the fire. Sparks swirled up into the dark. His hand was steady, but inside, a slow, simmering anger was beginning to boil. He had walked away today because he had no weapon but his fists against 6 armed men. He had walked away because he was just passing through. But he wasn't just passing through anymore. The look on Silas's face, the arrogance, the certainty that he owned the world and everyone in it, stuck in Jamie's throat like a burr. And the way Silas had looked at Ellen Ward. There was a threat there, a promise of violence wrapped in scripture. Jamie looked toward the horizon, in the direction of the Ward cabin. He didn't know why he cared. She was nothing to him. A stranger. She is just one woman, he muttered to the fire. And you are just one broken-down cowboy. But as he settled back into his blankets, he kept his revolver close to his hand. The wind howled through the junipers, sounding like a warning, or perhaps a cry for help. The night was cold, and the dawn felt a long way off. The valley held its breath in the hour before dawn. It was the coldest part of the night, a hollow gray stillness where the temperature dropped sharp enough to frost the sagebrush. The mist lay heavy and low along the winding line of the creek, a spectral white ribbon that obscured the water and clung to the roots of the cottonwoods. Nothing moved. The wind had died down, leaving the air brittle and silent. From somewhere deep in the foothills, a coyote yipped, a lonely, jagged sound that echoed once and then vanished, leaving the world heartbreakingly quiet. Ellen Ward was asleep, buried deep under 2 heavy quilts, dreaming of a garden she had planted when she was a girl in Ohio. In her dream, the soil was black and rich, not the red, dusty grit of the territory. Outside, the silence was broken by the muffled rhythm of hooves on soft earth. 5 riders emerged from the gloom, their horses stepping carefully through the brush, their breath plumed in the freezing air. Ghostly clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. They did not speak. They moved with the grim purpose of men who had convinced themselves that what they were doing was necessary, perhaps even holy. Silas Crow rode at the front. He sat tall in the saddle, his black coat buttoned to his chin against the chill. His face was a mask of stone, pale eyes fixed on the small, dark shape of the cabin ahead. He did not look like a man about to commit a crime. He looked like a man arriving for a sermon. He raised a gloved hand, and the riders behind him pulled up, their horses tossing their heads and champing at the bits. The leather creaked, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. "Quiet," Silas hissed. One of the men, a younger ranch hand named Thomas, shifted uneasily in his saddle. "Silas," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "The woman, she is inside. If the roof goes—" Silas turned his head slowly. The look he gave Thomas was not angry. It was pitying, the way a teacher looks at a slow child. "Fire cleanses. Thomas, we are not here to kill. We are here to drive out. We are putting out a bad light so the good can grow. Do you understand?" Thomas looked at the dark cabin, then back at Silas. He swallowed hard and nodded, though his grip on the reins was white-knuckled. "Then do your duty," Silas commanded softly. They dismounted, tying their horses to the low scrub brush 100 yards downwind. They moved on foot toward the cabin, carrying tin cans that sloshed with the heavy, pungent smell of kerosene. The cabin stood defenseless. It was a humble structure, built of love and desperation. Its logs settled deep into the earth. To Silas, it was a blight. It was a symbol of a woman refusing her place, a woman living without oversight, a vessel for whatever sins his mind had conjured to justify his greed for her water rights. They circled the structure. The men were nervous now, stifling their unease with cruel, silent gestures. One man, a bearded drifter Silas had hired for the season, grinned and mimed warming his hands. Silas did not smile. This was serious work. "Soak the corners," Silas whispered. "And the porch. Make sure it takes—" The liquid splashed against the dry wood with a dark, wet sound. The smell of kerosene rose up, sharp and chemical, cutting through the scent of sage and damp earth. They doused the front door. They threw the rest onto the wooden shingles of the roof where it sloped low. Silas stepped back. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a box of lucifer matches. He took one out, the sulfur head pale in the gloom. "For the purity of the valley," he murmured. "For the protection of the flock." He struck the match against the sole of his boot. It flared to life, a sudden, violent scratch of yellow light that illuminated his hard face and the hollows of his eyes. He tossed the match onto the kerosene-soaked porch. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a great intake of breath, the fuel caught. A sheet of blue and orange flame raced up the wall, devouring the dry logs. The fire roared to life, hungry and unnatural, shattering the morning silence. Inside, the dream of the Ohio garden turned dark. The smell of lilacs was replaced by the acrid stench of burning pine and oil. Ellen woke with a gasp, her lungs seizing. The room was not dark anymore. It was filled with a terrifying, shifting orange light that danced across the ceiling. The air was thick and gray, swirling with soot. She sat up, coughing, confusion making her sluggish. "Papa," she called out. The old instinct rising before memory slammed her back to the present. She was alone. The roar of the fire was deafening now, like a freight train passing directly overhead. Heat radiated from the front wall, intense enough to blister skin. She swung her legs out of bed, grabbing the quilt and wrapping it around her shoulders by instinct. She stumbled toward the door, but the heat drove her back. The wood was already warping, glowing red around the frame. She could hear the crackle of the roof beams above her, the groan of timber losing its structural fight. "No," she rasped, the word lost in a fit of coughing. "No, please." She spun around, eyes streaming, searching for the small side window on the west wall. The smoke was dropping lower, a suffocating blanket pressing her down. She dropped to her hands and knees, where the air was marginally clearer, and crawled. Her shin struck the edge of the table, but she didn't feel the pain. Panic was a cold spike in her chest, warring with the unbearable heat of the room. She reached the window. It was shuttered tight against the night chill. She pushed herself up, gasping for air, and hammered at the latch. It was stuck. The wood had swollen or the iron had rusted. "Open!" she screamed, her voice a ragged tear in her throat. "Open!" Behind her, something heavy crashed to the floor. The shelf with the books, the history of Rome, the poetry, the Bible, gone. She balled her fist, wrapped in the quilt, and smashed it against the wooden shutter. Once, twice. The latch gave way with a splintering crack. She pushed the shutters open and the cold morning air rushed in, feeding the fire behind her with a fresh draft of oxygen. The room seemingly exploded with new intensity. Ellen did not look back. She threw the quilt over the sill and scrambled through the opening. Her nightdress caught on a nail, tearing with a sharp rip. She kicked wildly, tumbling out of the window and hitting the hard earth shoulder first. She rolled away from the cabin, tangled in the quilt, scraping her knees and elbows on the rocks. She kept rolling until she hit the dirt, coughing so hard her vision went black. Her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. Her hair smelled of singed wool and smoke. She lay there for a moment, gasping, trying to force air into her body. The heat on her back was intense. She forced her eyes open. Through the tears and the smoke, she looked toward the creek. In the growing gray light of dawn, she saw them. Figures on horseback, 5 of them. They were silhouetted against the pale sky, watching the fire. They sat motionless, like vultures on a fence line. She could not make out their faces, just the shapes of their hats and the dark bulk of their coats. She tried to shout, to scream at them, to ask why, but all that came out was a dry, retching heave. The leader, a tall man on a large horse, raised his hand. He turned his mount slowly, almost lazily, and the others followed. They did not gallop away in fear. They trotted away with the casual arrogance of men who knew no one would stop them. Ellen dragged herself through the dirt, her fingers clawing at the grass. "Stop!" she wheezed. "Stop!" A terrible groaning sound came from behind her. She turned her head just as the roof of the cabin gave way. A shower of sparks shot up into the sky. A perverse firework display against the dawn. The walls folded in. The rocking chair. The letters. The lock of hair. The books. Everything she had saved. Everything she was. It was all gone. She collapsed into the dirt, her face pressed against the cold, damp earth, as the roar of the fire swallowed the silence of the valley. Miles away, on the ridge that separated the open range from the town limits. Jamie Cortez was already in the saddle. He had not slept well. The feeling of being watched, the anger of the previous day, had kept him restless. He had packed his bedroll in the dark, intending to ride into Red Hollow, collect his pay from the foreman who was staying at the hotel, and ride out before noon. He wanted to put the town and its preacher behind him. He crested the ridge, the sun just beginning to bleed a faint purple line along the eastern horizon. The air was crisp, biting at his exposed cheeks. He looked west, a habit born of years driving cattle, checking the weather and the land. His eyes narrowed. Against the deep blue of the western sky, a black stain was rising. It was not the white, drifting mist of the creek. It was dark, oily, and thick. It rose straight up in a pillar before spreading out like a bruise. "That is not a campfire," Jamie muttered. He knew the land. He knew the distances. That smoke was rising from the bend in the creek where the Ward cabin stood. A cold knot tightened in his stomach, harder and heavier than the one he had felt yesterday. He thought of the woman's hands on the flour sack. He thought of the way Silas Crow had looked at her in church, according to the whispers, putting out a bad light. "Damn it," Jamie hissed. He didn't think. He didn't weigh the consequences or consider that it was none of his business. He spurred the bay horse hard. "Yeah." The horse surged forward. Sensing the urgency in the rider, they scrambled down the shale slope of the ridge, dust flying, and hit the valley floor at a dead run. Jamie leaned low over the horse's neck, his hat pulled tight. The wind roared in his ears, but it couldn't drown out the sense of dread that was beating a rhythm in his chest. The ride took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. As he drew closer, the smell hit him, wood smoke, heavy and choking. He rounded the final bend of the creek and pulled the horse up so sharp the animal reared, pawing at the air. The cabin was gone. It was a glowing skeleton of timber. The walls collapsed inward, the roof a memory. Flames still licked lazily at the blackened logs, but the main fury of the fire had passed, leaving behind a devastation that was absolute. Jamie vaulted from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. His boots hit the ground, and he ran toward the ruin, shielding his face against the residual heat. "Ellen!" he shouted. "Miss Ward!" His voice cracked. There was no answer, only the popping of cooling wood and the hiss of the fire. He scanned the perimeter, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. She was inside. His mind whispered. They burned it and she was inside. Then he saw a shape in the tall grass near the creek bank, about 50 yards from the fire. A heap of fabric, motionless. "No," Jamie breathed. He ran to her, his limp forgotten. He dropped to his knees in the damp grass beside her. She was curled in a ball, wrapped in a quilt that was singed and muddy. Her hair was loose and wild, tangled with ash. Her skin was gray. She looked dead. Jamie's hands shook as he reached out. He touched her shoulder, terrified of what he would find. "Miss Ward." She didn't move. He placed his hand on the side of her neck, searching for a pulse. His fingers were calloused and rough against her skin. For a second, he felt nothing. Then, a flutter, weak, rapid, but there. "Alive," he whispered. "You are alive." He shifted his grip, sliding one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. As he lifted her, her head lolled back, and she let out a low, terrifying moan. Her eyes fluttered open, but they were unseeing, rolling white in her soot-stained face. "The box," she mumbled, her voice a rasp of broken gravel. "Papa's box, the blue ribbon." "Shh," Jamie said, pulling her against his chest. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering despite the heat coming from the ruin. "I have got you. You are safe." "The letters," she cried out, thrashing weakly in his arms. Her hands clawed at his coat, fingers hooked like talons. "They are burning the letters." "I have got you," Jamie repeated, his voice low and steady, a rumble against her ear. "I have got you, Ellen." He carried her away from the smoke, walking toward the shelter of a large cottonwood tree that grew by the water's edge. He moved carefully, absorbing the shock of his step so he wouldn't jostle her. She felt fragile in his arms, light as a bird, but the grip she had on his coat was surprisingly strong. He laid her down on the soft grass beneath the tree. He unbuckled his bedroll from his saddle and spread it out, then moved her onto it. She was coughing again, a deep, hacking sound that shook her whole frame. Jamie grabbed his canteen and his bandana. He soaked the cloth in the icy water of the creek. He knelt beside her. "I need you to breathe," he said gently. "Look at me." She blinked, her eyes focusing slowly. They were red-rimmed and bloodshot, the white stark against the soot on her face. She looked at him with a wild, animal panic. "Who?" she croaked. "It is Jamie," he said. "Jamie Cortez, from the store." He took the wet bandana and wiped her face. He started at her forehead, clearing away the gray ash, then moved to her cheeks. His touch was incredibly gentle, at odds with the rough, scarred look of his hands. He wiped the soot from her lips so she wouldn't taste the fire. She struggled to take a breath, clutching at her throat. "Can't air," Her collar was buttoned high, a modest wool nightdress that was choking her. Jamie hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "I am going to help you breathe," he said. With deft fingers, he undid the top 2 buttons of her nightdress, loosening the fabric around her neck. Her skin beneath was pale and untouched by the fire, a stark contrast to the destruction around them. The intimacy of the moment hung heavy in the air. Under any other sun, a man touching her like this, undressing her even this much, would be a scandal. But here, with the smell of ruin in the air, it was an act of desperate survival. He lifted her head, sliding his hand behind her neck to support her. He brought the canteen to her lips. "Small sips. Do not gulp it." She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, cutting tracks through the soot. He used his thumb to wipe the water away. Ellen closed her eyes, the cold water soothing the raw fire in her throat. The panic began to recede, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache in her body. She felt the solid warmth of the man beside her. He smelled of leather, horse, and tobacco, earthy smells that anchored her to the living world. She lay back, exhausted. Jamie sat back on his heels, watching her. He did not look away. He kept a vigil over her as the sun finally crested the mountains, flooding the valley with a cruel, bright light. Minutes passed. The only sound was the gurgle of the creek and the occasional crack of a settling timber from the cabin. Ellen pushed herself up to a sitting position. Her head swam, but she forced herself to stay upright. She looked past Jamie, toward the black scar on the earth that had been her home. The chimney stood. That was all. The stone chimney her father had built with his own hands, mixing the mortar with water from this very creek. It stood like a tombstone in a graveyard of ash. The reality of it hit her not as a sharp blow, but as a crushing weight. "It is all gone," she whispered. She thought of the quilt her mother had stitched in the last winter of her life. She thought of the letters from the war, the ink fading but the words still full of love. She thought of the Bible with her name written in it. Years of struggle, years of holding on when everyone said she should let go, years of loneliness endured because she had this place. "It is all gone," she said again, her voice breaking. She brought her hands to her face and began to weep. It was a raw, ugly sound, a tearing of the soul. She sobbed for the things she had lost, but mostly she sobbed for the violation of it, that men could come into her sanctuary and erase her existence with a match. Jamie sat beside her. He did not try to hush her. He did not offer empty platitudes about how she was lucky to be alive. He knew that sometimes survival felt like the cruelest punishment of all. He waited. Then, slowly, he reached out and rested his heavy hand on her shoulder. He didn't squeeze. He just let the weight of his hand rest there, a physical reminder that she was not alone in the dark. Ellen didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch, just slightly, her body seeking the heat of another human being. After a long time, the sobbing subsided to ragged breaths. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing the soot into streaks of war paint. "Did you see them?" Jamie asked quietly. Ellen nodded, staring at the ground. 5 of them, on horseback. "Could you see faces?" "No," she said. The light was behind them. They were just shadows." She paused, her brow furrowing as she replayed the nightmare. "But the leader, the one in front," Jamie's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. "What about him?" "He sat high," Ellen said, "stiff, like he was judging the world. He wore a long coat, a split-tail coat, and he didn't run. He just turned his horse, slow, like he had all the time in the world." She looked up at Jamie then, her eyes searching his face. He quoted scripture before he lit the match. "I heard him. He said something about putting out a bad light." Jamie's face hardened. The muscles in his jaw bunched as he ground his teeth. The sympathy in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, glittering darkness. "Silas," he said. It wasn't a question. "You know," Ellen whispered. "I know that coat," Jamie said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "And I know that walk. And I know that no other man in this valley would burn a woman out of her home and call it holy work." He stood up, the movement abrupt. He walked to the edge of the creek and stared into the water, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He needed to hit something. He needed to break something. Ellen watched him. She saw the violence coiling in him, but she didn't feel afraid. It was a strange sensation. For years, she had feared men and their anger, but this anger, this was not directed at her. It was a shield. "Help me up," she said. Jamie turned. He walked back and offered her his hands. She took them, and he pulled her to her feet. Her legs were shaky, and she swayed. He caught her by the elbows, steadying her. "You should rest," he said. "No," Ellen said. She pulled her quilt tighter around her. "I need to see." She walked toward the ruins. The heat was still radiating from the stone chimney, warm on her face. The air was filled with gray ash that floated like snow, settling in her hair and on her eyelashes. She stepped into the footprint of the cabin. Her boots crunched on charcoal and broken glass. Here was the iron stove, overturned and white with heat. Here was the frame of her bed, twisted metal. She walked to the corner where the rocking chair had been. There was nothing but a pile of white ash. She fell to her knees in the debris, ignoring the heat that seeped through her dress. She began to dig. She used her bare hands, shifting the hot coals and ash, frantically searching. "Ellen, stop," Jamie said, stepping up behind her. "You will burn yourself." "I have to find it," she gasped. "The box! The metal box!" She dug until her fingers were black. Then, her hand struck something hard. She pulled it free. It was the strongbox. The wood that lined it had burned away, and the metal was warped and blackened. The lock fused shut. She grabbed a stone and smashed it against the lid. Once, twice. The metal groaned and popped open. Inside, it was mostly ash. The Bible was gone. The letters were black flakes that disintegrated as the wind touched them. But at the bottom, shielded by the remains of the book, was a single sheet of paper, the corner of a letter, brown and brittle but legible. And beside it, the silver brooch. The glass was cracked, and the silver was tarnished black, but the lock of hair inside was untouched. Ellen picked up the brooch. It was warm. She curled her fingers around it, clutching it to her chest, bowing her head over the ruin of her life. Jamie stood over her. He looked at the devastation, at the woman kneeling in the ashes of her history. He looked at the single, pitiful treasure she held. He felt the old injury in his leg throb, a phantom pain from a beating 5 years ago. He remembered Silas Crow's face in the saloon yesterday, the wages of wrath. Jamie made no sound, but inside him, a door had closed. He was done drifting. He was done walking away. He looked at the sun rising over the ridge. It would be a long day. But he made a promise to the silence, a vow carved in smoke and ash. Silas Crow had started this fire at dawn, but Jamie Cortez would decide how the day ended. "We have to go to the sheriff," Jamie said. He stood amidst the smoking ruins, his voice cutting through the heavy silence that followed Ellen's grief. Ellen looked up from the ashes, her hands still clutching the blackened metal box and the tarnished brooch. The suggestion felt like a physical blow. She looked down at herself. Her nightdress was torn at the hem and stained with mud. The quilt wrapped around her shoulders was singed. Her hair, usually pinned back and covered with a bonnet, hung in wild, soot-choked tangles around a face streaked with charcoal and tears. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I cannot go there. Not like this." "He burned your home. Ellen, that is a crime. Even in this territory, that is a crime. You know what they will see," she countered, her voice trembling with a mix of shame and rising panic. "They will not see a victim. They will see what they have always wanted to see, the wild woman, the slattern who lives alone. They will say I brought this on myself." She pulled the quilt tighter, trying to hide the exposed skin at her throat where Jamie had loosened her collar to help her breathe. The memory of his touch, gentle, necessary, yet shockingly intimate, burned hotter than the embers of her cabin. Jamie stepped closer. He did not look at her with pity, which she would have hated. He looked at her with a hard, terrifying resolve. Let them look, let them stare, but make them look at the truth. If we stay here, Silas wins. If we ride away, Silas wins. The only way he loses is if you stand in front of the law and point a finger at him. Ellen looked at the chimney, the tombstone of her father's dream. She looked at the horizon where Silas and his men had vanished. She felt a cold kernel of hatred harden in her stomach, sitting heavy alongside the fear. "My horse," she said quietly. "Bess is in the lean-to. If the smoke didn't get her." "I checked," Jamie said. "She is spooked, but she is fine. But we will take my horse. He is faster, and I am not leaving your side." He helped her up. She felt lightheaded, her knees threatening to buckle, but his grip on her arm was like an iron band. He led her to his bay gelding, which stood watching them with wide, nervous eyes. Jamie mounted first, then reached down. Ellen took his forearm, solid, warm, and he swung her up behind him. She settled onto the horse's rump, her legs dangling, her arms tentatively wrapping around his waist. "Hold on," he said. "Do not let go." They turned away from the black smear of the cabin and rode toward Red Hollow. The journey was a blur of motion and pain. The land stretched out around them, vast and indifferent. Low hills rolled like waves in a dry sea, covered in gray-green sage and scattered juniper trees that twisted toward the sun. The sky was a hard, enamel blue, empty of clouds. Ellen pressed her face against Jamie's back to shield her eyes from the wind. She could feel every muscle in his torso shift as he guided the horse. Every jolt of the gallop sent a shock through her exhausted body, reminding her how close she was to simply sliding off and letting the earth take her. But the warmth of him kept her upright. He was a solid wall against the world. She breathed in the scent of him, sweat, old leather, dust, and the faint, sweet smell of tobacco. It was a masculine, working smell, foreign to her life of solitude, and it made her feel strangely safe. "Why?" she asked, her voice lost in the wind at first. She leaned closer, speaking into his shoulder. "Why are you doing this? You could have just ridden on. You could be halfway to the border by now." Jamie slowed the horse to a trot as they navigated a rocky, dry wash. He didn't answer immediately. He scanned the ridgeline, his eyes narrow slits beneath the brim of his hat. "I told you," he said finally. "I know, Silas. That is not enough reason to walk into a fire," Ellen said. Jamie shifted his weight. 5 years ago, I was working the branding season at the Crow Ranch. Just a hand, just a drifter passing through." His voice was low, vibrating through his chest against her cheek. "There was a boy there, Mateo. He was 12 years old, stable hand, scrawny little thing, reminded me of my younger brother." Ellen listened, her grip on his coat tightening. "Silas lost a saddle, a fancy one, with silver tooling. He decided Mateo stole it. There was no proof, but Silas does not need proof. He has his righteousness." Jamie spat into the dust. "He tied the boy to a post. He took a bullwhip to him. I was the only one who stepped in." "What did you do?" Ellen whispered. "I grabbed the whip. I told Silas that God does not look kindly on men who beat children. I thought because he called himself a preacher, the words would matter." Jamie let out a short, bitter laugh. "He had 4 men hold me down. He told them to teach me a lesson about hierarchy, about blood. He said mongrels need to be broken before they can be useful." Ellen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. She thought of Jamie's limp, the way he favored his left leg. She thought of the scars on his knuckles. "They broke 3 ribs," Jamie continued, his voice devoid of emotion, reciting a list of inventory. "They broke my leg in 2 places, and Silas, he just stood there. He watched. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just watched like he was watching a fence being mended, like it was just work that needed doing." He turned his head slightly, just enough that she could see the sharp angle of his jaw. "I dragged myself 5 miles to a creek bed after they dumped me. It took me 6 months to walk right again. I promised myself if I ever saw him again, I would not be the one on the ground." Ellen rested her forehead against his back. The connection between them shifted. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It wasn't just a rescue. She realized that Jamie carried a charred ruin inside him, just as she now carried the memory of her burning cabin. They were both scarred things, pressed down by men like Silas Crow, told they were less than, told they didn't belong. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Do not be sorry," Jamie said, spurring the horse back into a canter. "Be angry." Red Hollow appeared on the horizon like a smudge of brown against the blue. As they rode closer, the buildings took shape, the white steeple of the church, the flat roof of the saloon, the rows of houses with their neatly swept porches. Ellen felt her stomach turn. She tried to smooth her hair, but her hands came away black with soot. She pulled the blanket up until it covered her nose, hiding her face, hiding the shame. They rode down Main Street. It was mid-morning, and the town was awake. A wagon loaded with lumber rumbled past. A group of men stood outside the barber shop. The noise of the town seemed to die away as they passed. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. They saw Jamie Cortez, the dark-skinned drifter, riding a tired horse, and behind him, clinging to his waist, was the ward woman. She looked like a specter risen from a grave. Her bare feet dangled, dirty and scraped. The quilt was a beggar's cloak. Ellen kept her eyes down, staring at the horse's mane, but she could feel the gazes. They felt like physical touches, crawling over her skin, judging, dismissing. "Look at her," a woman's voice drifted from the boardwalk, sharp and loud. "I told you, no good comes from that cabin. Looks like she finally found herself a bed warmer." A man chuckled. Jamie's back went rigid. His hand dropped to the revolver at his hip, resting there. A warning. He did not stop, but he slowed the horse to a walk, staring down the man who had spoken until the laughter died in the man's throat. They pulled up in front of the sheriff's office. It was a small brick building with iron bars on the window. Jamie dismounted, favoring his bad leg, and then reached up for Ellen. She hesitated. This was the moment. If she stepped down, she was making it real. She was entering the arena. "Come on," Jamie said softly. "Head up. You have done nothing wrong." She slid down into his arms. For a moment, he held her, steadying her on the uneven ground. Then he let go, and she stood on the wooden boardwalk, clutching her quilt, shivering despite the heat. They went inside. Sheriff Briggs was sitting at his desk, nursing a cup of coffee and reading a month-old newspaper. He was a man shaped by compromise, soft in the middle, with tired eyes that had seen too much and done too little. He looked up, and his eyebrows shot toward his hairline. "Good Lord, Miss Ward." "My cabin," Ellen said, her voice raspy. "It is gone. Sheriff, burned to the ground." Briggs stood up slowly, wiping coffee from his mustache. "Burned? A stove fire? I told you that flue was—" "It was arson," Jamie cut in. His voice filled the small room, bouncing off the brick walls. "5 men, riders. They doused it with kerosene and lit it while she was sleeping inside." Briggs looked from Ellen to Jamie, his expression shifting from shock to a guarded wariness. "That is a serious accusation. Son, attempted murder." "It was murder," Ellen said, finding her voice. "They didn't care if I got out. They blocked the door with fire." "Who?" Briggs asked. He picked up a pencil, but he didn't write anything down. "Silas Crow," Jamie said. The pencil clattered onto the desk. Briggs sighed. A long, weary exhalation. He looked at Ellen with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Now, hold on. Silas? That is a big stone to throw. Mr. Cortez. Silas is a pillar of this town." "He was there," Ellen said. "I saw him. I saw his coat. I heard his voice." "Did you see his face?" Briggs asked. "Did you look him in the eye?" "It was dark. There was smoke," Ellen stammered. "But I know it was him. He quoted scripture while he did it." Briggs shook his head. "So, no positive identification. Just a silhouette and a voice in the panic. Miss Ward, I am truly sorry for your loss. But I cannot go arresting a man like Silas Crow on the word of on your word, without witnesses." "I am a witness," Jamie growled. "You arrived after the fact. Briggs pointed out. And frankly, given your history with Mr. Crow, a jury would say you have an axe to grind. So you will do nothing? Ellen asked, her voice rising. I have nothing left. I have the clothes on my back and a handful of ash. And you are going to sit there and talk about juries? The door behind them opened. A bell chimed cheerfully. Is everything all right in here? Sheriff, I heard shouting. The voice was rich, deep, and smooth as oil. Ellen froze. She turned slowly. Silas Crow stood in the doorway. He looked immaculate. His black coat was brushed free of dust. His white shirt was crisp. He held his hat in his hands, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. He looked like the picture of a concerned citizen. He looked at Ellen, and his eyes widened in a performance of perfect shock. Sister Ward, he said. My heavens, what has happened to you? You look like you have walked through the valley of the shadow itself. Ellen stared at him, unable to breathe. The audacity of it choked her. Her cabin burned down this morning. Silas, Briggs said, sounding relieved to have the tension broken. Terrible business. Burned. Silas stepped forward, shaking his head. Oh, that is a tragedy. A true tragedy. I have always said, living out there alone. So far from help. It is a dangerous thing for a woman. He reached out as if to touch Ellen's arm. She recoiled violently, backing into Jamie. Silas paused, his hand hovering in the air. He lowered it slowly, a sad smile playing on his lips. He looked at her soot-streaked face, her bare feet, the wildness in her eyes. And in that look, Ellen saw it, the satisfaction, the cold, glittering triumph. I have unmade you, his eyes said. I have turned you into the trash I always said you were. We must help her, of course, Silas said, turning to the sheriff. My wife runs the ladies' circle. We can find some cast-off clothes for her. Maybe find her some work in the scullery at the hotel. A woman in her position. She will need charity. The word charity sounded like filth coming from his mouth. Jamie moved. It was a subtle shift, but the air in the room changed instantly. He stepped in front of Ellen, placing himself between her and Silas. His hand hovered inches from the walnut grip of his Colt revolver. Drop the mask, Silas, Jamie said softly. It does not fit you. Silas looked at Jamie, his expression hardening. I warned you, boy. I warned you about trouble. I found the tracks, Jamie lied, his voice steady. I know exactly where you rode. I know where you stopped to watch it burn. I know which one of your men dropped a glove near the creek. It was a bluff. There was no glove, but for a fraction of a second, Silas's eyes flickered, a tiny twitch of doubt. You are delirious, Silas said, though his voice was tighter now. Sheriff, this man is threatening me. He is bearing false witness. A false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaketh lies shall not escape. That is enough. Briggs slammed his hand on the desk. He stood up, looking nervous. Jamie, take your hand away from that gun, right now, or you will be in a cell. He burned her home, Jamie said, not looking at the sheriff. He was staring into Silas's soul. And he is going to pay for it. Not here, Briggs shouted. Not in my town. Now get out, both of you, before I lock you up for disturbing the peace. Ellen felt the room spinning. The injustice of it was suffocating. The sheriff was protecting the monster. The town was protecting the monster. Come on, she said, grabbing Jamie's arm. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't breathe this air. Jamie, please! Jamie held Silas's gaze for one long, heart-stopping second. This isn't over. Crow! It was over before it started, Silas sneered. Ellen turned and ran. She burst out of the office, blindly pushing past a couple on the boardwalk who gasped at her appearance. She didn't care. She ran down the alleyway beside the livery stable, her bare feet slamming against the hard dirt, seeking the only darkness she could find. Jamie caught up to her behind the livery stable, in a narrow, shadowed space between the rough wood of the barn and a stack of hay bales. It smelled of manure and dry straw, buzzing with flies, but it was hidden from the street. Ellen was pacing, her hands tangled in her hair, pulling at the soot-stained strands. She was shaking so hard her teeth clicked together. "Ellen," Jamie said, reaching for her. She spun on him. "Do not touch me." She shoved him. It was a weak shove, her hand slipping on his dusty coat, but she put all her fury into it. "You brought me here," she screamed, though she kept her voice to a harsh whisper. "You said we should go to the law. You said they would listen. Look at me. Jamie, look at what you made me do." She shoved him again. "They looked at me like I was a dog, and he stood there. He stood there and offered me his wife's old clothes." Jamie didn't move. He stood like a rock, letting her strike his chest. He let her pour all the shame and the terror out onto him. He knew she wasn't angry at him. She was angry at the world. "I hate them," she sobbed, hitting him one last time, her fist thumping uselessly against his sternum. "I hate them all." Her legs gave out. She crumbled forward, sliding down. Jamie caught her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her up and into him. She fought for a second, stiff and unyielding, and then she broke. She collapsed against him, burying her face in his neck, her hands clutching the back of his coat as if she were drowning. "I know," he murmured into her hair. "I know." They stood there in the shadows, locked together. The heat of the day was rising, baking the smell of hay and dust around them. Ellen's breath came in ragged gasps against his throat. She could feel the heavy, rapid thud of his heart against her chest. Slowly, the sobbing stopped. The frantic energy drained away, leaving something else in its place, a raw, vibrating tension. They were two people who had been stripped of everything. They had no home. They had no allies. All they had was the heat of the other person's body in the dark. Ellen pulled back slightly, lifting her head. Her face was inches from his. She saw the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. She saw the pulse beating at his temple. She saw the way his gaze dropped to her mouth, then snapped back up to her eyes, dark with a hunger that terrified and thrilled her. His hand moved up her back, splaying wide between her shoulder blades. It was a possessive touch, protective, mine. Her breath hitched. The air between them felt charged, electric, heavy. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted to forget the fire and the sheriff and Silas Crow. She wanted to disappear into the solid reality of him. She leaned in. He leaned in. Their lips were a breath apart. She could feel the warmth of his exhale. Then, Jamie pulled back. He closed his eyes for a second, exhaling sharply, as if in pain. He gripped her arms and set her gently away from him, creating a foot of distance that felt like a mile. "No," he said, his voice rough, like gravel grinding together. "Not like this. Not while we are running. Not while we are afraid." Ellen stared at him, her lips parted, her skin tingling where he had held her. She felt rejected, and then she understood. He didn't want this to be another desperate act. He wanted it to be a choice. Jamie opened his eyes. The heat was gone, replaced by the cold, lethal resolve she had seen at the creek. "I made a promise," he said. "I told you I would make him beg." "Jamie," Ellen whispered. "The sheriff won't help. There is nothing we can do." "The law's a piece of paper. Ellen, justice is something else." He checked the cylinder of his revolver, spinning it with a metallic click. "I'm going to finish this. Today, before the sun sets. Silas Crow is going to be on his knees." It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact, as inevitable as the coming night. "He will kill you," Ellen said. "He has men. You are one man with a bad leg." "I have been one man my whole life," Jamie said. "I am used to the odds." He turned to walk back toward the street, toward his horse. "Wait," Ellen said. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She straightened her spine. She looked at the torn hem of her dress, at her dirty feet. She looked at the man who was willing to die for her honor when no one else would even look her in the eye. "You are not going alone," she said. Jamie stopped. He looked back at her. "Ellen, no. It is too dangerous. I want you to stay at the hotel. Lock the door." "No," she said. Her voice was stronger now. The steel that had helped her survive 3 winters alone in a cabin was back. "It was my home. It was my father's Bible. It is my fight." She walked up to him. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side tempered. "If you go after him, I go with you. I won't hide in a room while you bleed for me." Jamie looked at her for a long moment. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw. He nodded. Once, acknowledging her, accepting her as a partner. "We need supplies," he said, "and we need to ride fast. They will be heading for the high pastures, up in the canyon." "I know the way," Ellen said. They left the shadows of the livery. They did not look at the townspeople as they mounted the horse again. They rode out of Red Hollow, past the church, past the sheriff's office, past the eyes of the people who had failed them. They rode toward the broken country to the west, toward the dry ravines and the rocky outcrops of the Crow Range. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and upcoming violence. High overhead, a pair of vultures circled lazily in the thermal currents, waiting to see what the evening would bring. The land held its breath. The chase was on. The sun climbed higher, transforming the vast, open sky into a crucible of white heat. The morning chill had evaporated hours ago, replaced by a dry, relentless temperature that baked the moisture from the earth and turned the air into a shimmering haze. Ellen and Jamie rode in silence, their eyes fixed on the ground. The trail Silas and his men had left was not difficult to follow, even for a novice, but Jamie read it with a precision that bordered on sorcery. To Ellen, the ground looked like an endless expanse of hard-packed dirt and scrub, but to Jamie, it was a ledger of recent history. He slowed the bay horse, leaning over the saddle horn to study a patch of loose shale. "They are moving fast," Jamie said, his voice roughened by the dust. "But they are careless. Arrogance makes a man heavy in the saddle." He pointed to a crushed sprig of sagebrush, its broken stem oozing a pungent, herbal scent into the heat. "See that? The brake is fresh. The sap is still wet. They passed here less than an hour ago." Ellen tightened her grip on his waist. "Can we catch them?" "We will catch them," Jamie promised. "Look here." He guided the horse forward a few paces to a patch of softer sand near a dry wash. "You see the depth of that print? The one on the left?" Ellen squinted against the glare. She saw a hoof print, deeper at the toe than the heel. "That horse is favoring its off foreleg," Jamie explained. "It has thrown a shoe or picked up a stone. That is the horse Thomas rides. I remember it from the ranch. A roan gelding with a bad temper. If the horse is lame, they will have to slow down, or Thomas will be walking." They pushed on. The landscape grew more rugged, the rolling plains giving way to the broken, chaotic geography of the Badlands. Here, the earth had been cracked open by ancient forces, leaving behind a maze of canyons, sheer cliffs, and dry riverbeds that wound like scars across the valley floor. The heat became oppressive. The sun was a physical weight on their shoulders, pressing them down against the saddle. The bay horse was lathered in sweat, its coat dark and slick, its breathing heavy in the thin air. "We need to rest the horse," Jamie said, scanning the terrain. "Just for a moment. If we ride him into the ground, we are walking back to town." He steered them toward a narrow arroyo, a deep gash in the earth where the shadows offered a reprieve from the sun. The walls of the canyon rose 20 feet on either side, layered in bands of red and ochre sandstone. A twisted mesquite tree clung to the edge of the overhang, casting a pool of shade on the sandy floor. Jamie dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He reached up and helped Ellen down. Her legs were stiff, and she stumbled slightly as her feet hit the ground. Jamie's hands were there instantly, steadying her, his grip firm on her waist. "Easy," he murmured. He led the horse to the shade, loosening the cinch to let the animal breathe. He poured a small amount of water from his canteen into his hat, letting the horse drink first. It was a small act of discipline that spoke volumes about the man. Ellen sank down onto a flat rock in the shadow of the canyon wall. She felt lightheaded, the world tilting slightly on its axis. The adrenaline that had carried her out of town was fading, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. She looked at her hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. vibrating with a tremor she could not stop. Jamie approached her, the canteen in his hand. He uncorked it and offered it to her. "Drink," he said. "Slowly." Ellen took the canteen. The metal was warm, but the water inside was cool. She lifted it to her lips, but her hands shook so badly that water spilled down her chin and onto the front of her ruined dress. She lowered the canteen, humiliation burning in her cheeks. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I cannot seem to stop." Jamie didn't speak. He reached out and gently took the canteen from her hands. He set it on the ground. Then he crouched in front of her, bringing his face level with hers. He didn't touch her. He just looked at her, dead. His eyes were dark and steady, an anchor in the spinning world. He watched her with an intensity that stripped away the noise and the fear. He breathed in, a slow, deep inhalation, and then exhaled just as slowly, unconsciously. Ellen matched his rhythm. She inhaled, she exhaled. Jamie nodded, a microscopic movement. He held her gaze, refusing to let her look away, refusing to let her retreat into the shame. Under that unwavering attention, the trembling in her hands began to subside, her heart rate slowed, sinking with the quiet strength radiating from him. It was more intimate than if he had held her. It was a tethering of souls. "Better?" he asked softly. Ellen nodded. "Yes, thank you." The silence of the arroyo was absolute. No wind reached down here, no birds sang. It felt like they were the last two people on Earth, hiding in a crack in the planet while the rest of the world burned away. Ellen looked down at her lap, at the soot-stained fabric of her nightdress, at the bare, scraped toes peeking out from under the hem. She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Look at me," she said, her voice brittle. "I am a sight. No home, no family, no shoes. I have nothing left to lose. Jamie, if Silas kills us today, I suppose he is just finishing the job." Jamie's expression darkened. He shifted, moving closer until his knee brushed against her shin. The contact sent a jolt through her. "Do not say that," he said, his voice low and fierce. "It is the truth," Ellen said, looking up at him, tears pricking her eyes. "Everything it was in that cabin, it was in that box." "No," Jamie said. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed away a smudge of ash near her eye. "That cabin was wood. That box was paper. You are not wood and paper. Ellen." He leaned in closer, his eyes searching hers, demanding she believe him. "You have your stubbornness," he said. "I saw it when you walked into that mercantile with your head high. You have your name, which you kept clean when this whole valley tried to drag it through the mud. And you have your right to the land. They can burn the house, but they cannot burn the deed. And they cannot burn your right to stand on that earth." Ellen's breath hitched. His hand was warm against her face, rough and calloused. A warrior's hand that was trying so hard to be gentle. "I have never seen anyone as brave as you," Jamie whispered. "Not in the war. Not on the trail. You are the strongest thing I have ever known." The words broke something inside her, the dam of control she had built over years of solitude. The wall she had erected to keep out the pity and the scorn. Shattered. She didn't think. She reached for his hand, the one resting on her cheek, and interlaced her fingers with his. She turned her face into his palm, closing her eyes, breathing in the scent of him. "Jamie," she breathed. She opened her eyes and saw the raw hunger in his face. It mirrored her own. It was a hunger born of death and fire, a desperate need to affirm life in the face of destruction. She leaned forward. He met her halfway. The kiss was not tentative. It was sudden, hard, and desperate. It was a collision. Jamie made a low sound in his throat, a growl of long-suppressed want. He didn't pull back. He pressed her gently back against the warm sandstone wall of the arroyo, his body covering hers, shielding her, claiming her. Ellen gripped the front of his shirt, her fists bunching the fabric, pulling him closer. She needed to feel the solidity of him. She needed to know that he was real, that this heat between them was real. She opened her mouth to him, and the kiss deepened, becoming a frantic exploration. All the fear of the morning, the terror of the fire, the fury at the sheriff, the loneliness of the last 5 years, it all poured into that kiss. It was a reclamation. His hand slid from her cheek to the back of her neck, tangling in her matted hair, holding her head steady as he devoured her mouth. Her hands moved up his chest, over his shoulders, feeling the hard muscle beneath the coat. Desire flared hot and bright, a wildfire that threatened to consume them both. For a moment, the danger outside didn't matter. Silas didn't matter. The only thing that existed was the taste of him, the salt on his skin, the roughness of his stubble against her face. Jamie broke the kiss, gasping for air, but he didn't move away. He rested his forehead against hers, their noses brushing. His breathing was ragged, his heart hammering against her chest where their bodies were pressed together. He pulled back just an inch, his eyes searching hers, dark with passion but also with a question. He was giving her a way out. He was giving her space to say stop. Ellen looked at him. She saw the scars on his face, the worry in his eyes. She saw the man who had ridden into the fire for her. "Do not stop," she whispered. "Please, I do not want to be afraid." She reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "I have been afraid for so long," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Afraid of the town, afraid of the silence, afraid of being alone. If we live through this day, I do not want to be alone tonight, or any night." The vulnerability in her voice nearly brought him to his knees. Jamie closed his eyes, shuddering as he fought for control. He wanted her. God, he wanted her more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. But he heard the wind whistling above the canyon rim. He knew Silas was out there. "We will live," Jamie said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise you, Ellen, we will live." He kissed her again, but this time it was slower. It was a seal on a promise. His lips moved over hers with a reverence that made her heart ache. His hands moved down her arms, soothing, grounding. "But not here," he whispered against her lips. "Not in the dirt. When I take you, it will be on a bed, with a door that locks, and no one hunting us. It will be safe." Ellen nodded, tears slipping from her eyes. "Safe," she repeated. It sounded like a prayer. They stayed there for a long moment, foreheads pressed together, sharing the same air. They were breathless, shaken, but steady. The frantic energy had settled into a deep, vibrating bond. They were no longer just two people running from a fire. They were a unit. They had chosen each other in the eye of the storm. Jamie pulled back slowly, reluctantly. He smoothed her hair back from her face. "We have to go. The longer we wait, the further they get." Ellen took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I am ready." Jamie helped her stand. He checked his revolver again. A reflex, and then tightened the cinch on the horse. The moment of peace was over. The hunt was back on. They rode out of the arroyo and back into the blinding sun. The terrain grew tighter, more treacherous. They were entering the foothills of the high range, a place of boulder-strewn gullies and dry creek beds lined with thick, thorny scrub. Jamie rode with his hand on his thigh, near his gun. His eyes never stopped moving, scanning the ridge lines, the shadows behind the rocks, the movement of the brush. The trail was fresher now. The dust in the hoof prints had not yet settled. "They are close," Jamie murmured. "They have slowed down. That lame horse is costing them time." He guided the bay into a narrow ravine, the walls rising steep and jagged on either side. It was a natural ambush point, and Jamie's nerves were singing with tension. "Keep your head down," he told Ellen over his shoulder. "If anything happens, you slide off and get behind cover. Do not wait for me to tell you." "I understand," Ellen said. She felt the tension in his body and mirrored it. They rounded a blind corner, a massive slab of granite blocking the view ahead. Crack. The sound was sharp and dry, like a whip snapping, but infinitely louder. A puff of dust exploded from the rock face inches from Jamie's head. "Down!" Jamie shouted. He didn't wait for her to move. He swung his arm back, sweeping Ellen off the horse's rump. She hit the ground rolling, scrambling on her hands and knees toward the cover of a large boulder. Jamie bailed off the horse on the opposite side, slapping the bay's flank to send it running back down the ravine, out of the line of fire. Crack! Crack! 2 more shots rang out from the ridgeline above them. One bullet whined off a rock. The other kicked up dirt near Ellen's feet. "Are you hit?" Jamie yelled, pressing himself flat against the canyon wall. "No!" Ellen shouted back. She was huddled behind the boulder, her arms over her head, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "I am fine. Stay down." Jamie moved. He didn't just hide, he hunted. He scrambled up a pile of scree, moving from rock to rock with a fluid grace. He reached a vantage point, a notch in the granite, and leveled his revolver. He waited. He was a statue carved from the stone itself. On the ridge above, a silhouette popped up, a man in a dusty coat, trying to get a better angle on the woman below. Jamie fired. The shot echoed through the canyon like a cannon blast. The man on the ridge cried out, a sharp yelp of pain. He spun around, dropping his rifle, and clutched his shoulder. He scrambled backward, disappearing behind the crest of the hill. "Thomas!" a voice shouted from above. It was Silas. "Get back! He has the range!" "He shot me!" the man wailed. "My arm!" Jamie cocked the hammer again, his eyes cold. "That was for the horse," he muttered. He fired 2 more shots, spacing them out, pinning the men down. He used the land as a weapon, firing at the rocks above them to send showers of stone splinters raining down on their heads. The dust clouds obscured their vision, turning the ambush into chaos. "They are running!" Jamie shouted to Ellen. He was right. The sound of hooves scrambling on loose rock drifted down from the ridge. They were retreating, not fighting. Jamie slid down the scree slope, landing near Ellen. He whistled for the bay horse, which trotted back nervously, eyes wide. "They are heading for the gap," Jamie said, holstering his gun. "The ravine that overlooks the town. Silas wants the high ground. He wants to be able to see Red Hollow." "Why?" Ellen asked, accepting his hand as he pulled her up. "Because he is a narcissist," Jamie said. "He wants to watch his kingdom while he decides who lives and who dies, and he thinks we cannot get to him there." "Can we?" "We can," Jamie said. "But we have to be faster than the sun." He swung into the saddle and pulled her up. "Hold tight, Ellen. We are going to ride hard." They tore out of the ravine, pushing the horse to its limit. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, bruised shadows across the Badlands. The light was turning golden and heavy, the prelude to twilight. They raced against time. They navigated the treacherous ground, leaping over fallen logs, sliding down shale slopes, forcing their way through thickets of manzanita that tore at Jamie's trousers and Ellen's quilt. Sweat streaked their faces, mixing with the grit and the ash. They were exhausted, battered, and thirsty, but they did not stop. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the terrain began to rise sharply. They were climbing the back of the ridge that loomed over Red Hollow. The air grew cooler, the wind picking up, whipping their hair into their eyes. Finally, they reached the plateau. Jamie pulled the horse up. "There," he said, breathing hard. Ahead of them, about 200 yards away, was a rocky shelf that jutted out over the valley. It was a dead end, a natural pulpit of stone. Silas Crow and 2 of his remaining men were there. Their horses were ground-tied near the back of the shelf. The man Jamie had shot, Thomas, was sitting on a rock, clutching a bloody bandana to his shoulder. The other man stood nervously with his rifle. Silas stood at the edge of the precipice. He was looking down at Red Hollow, which lay like a toy town in the distance below. The buildings were casting long shadows. The sky behind Silas was turning a deep, violent red, as if the heavens themselves were bleeding. Jamie dismounted. He didn't help Ellen down this time. She slid off on her own, standing beside him. "Stay behind me," Jamie said. "No," Ellen said. She stepped up beside him. "We do this together." They walked forward. The wind on the plateau was fierce, snapping the fabric of Silas's coat. Silas turned. He saw them coming. He didn't raise a weapon. He simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, watching them approach with a look of supreme, maddening calm. "You are persistent." "Mr. Cortez," Silas called out. His voice was carried by the wind. "I will give you that." Jamie didn't stop until they were 20 paces away. He stood with his legs apart, his hand hanging loose near his gun. Ellen stood at his shoulder, wrapped in her dirty quilt, looking like an avenging spirit rising from the earth. "It is over." "Silas," Jamie said. "Nowhere left to run." "Run!" Silas laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. "I do not run from the ungodly. I ascended. I came here to pray for the souls of this valley. To pray for you, Jamie." "Save your prayers," Jamie said. "And tell your man to put the rifle down, or I will put a hole in him that prayer won't fix." Silas nodded to the nervous gunman. "Put it down. Nervous, Nellie? We have no need of violence. The Lord is our shield." The man lowered the rifle, looking relieved. "You burned her home," Jamie said. "You tried to kill her." "I cleansed a wound," Silas corrected, his voice taking on that preaching cadence again. "I acted as a shepherd protecting his flock from the wolf. This woman, she is a corruption, a blight. She squats on land that should belong to a righteous family. She lives in sin. I live in peace." Ellen stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. It cut through the wind. "I lived in peace until you came." Silas looked at her with a sneer. "Peace? You live in squalor. You live without a head of house. It is unnatural." "You talk about unnatural?" Jamie stepped forward, his anger cold and precise. "Let us talk about unnatural. Silas, let us talk about the foreman you fired 3 years ago because he caught you skimming from the ranch accounts. Let us talk about the widow in Tombstone you swindled out of her herd." Silas's eyes narrowed. "Lies, slander." "Let us talk about Mateo," Jamie said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "The boy you whipped. The boy who never walked right again. Did you pray for him? Silas, did you pray while you peeled the skin off his back?" The color drained from Silas's face. The men behind him exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Silas was hard, but they hadn't heard these stories. "You are a devil," Silas hissed. "A lying, half-breed devil. And you are a coward hiding behind a Bible," Jamie said. Ellen took another step. She let the quilt fall from her shoulders. She stood there in her torn, soot-stained nightdress, looking small and fragile against the vastness of the sky, but her eyes were burning. "I woke up choking," she said. She didn't shout. She spoke to the men behind Silas. She spoke to the sky. "I woke up with fire on the walls. I crawled out of a window while my roof collapsed." She looked at Silas. "You didn't just burn wood," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her loss. "You burned my mother's quilt, the one she made while she was dying of consumption. You burned the letters my father wrote from the war, the only words I had left of his voice. You burned the table where we ate our supper. You burned the history of a family that worked harder and loved deeper than you ever will." She pointed a shaking finger at him. "You took the last place on this earth that felt like mine. You took it because you are greedy, and you are small, and you cannot stand that I didn't need you." The wind howled around the rocky point. Silas stood there, his face twitching. The veneer of the holy man was cracking. He wasn't being confronted by a monster or a harlot. He was being confronted by a woman grieving her mother's quilt. "It was necessary," Silas muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked at his men, but they were looking at their boots. "It was cruelty," Ellen said. "And it ends now." Jamie stepped up beside her. The sun was touching the horizon, casting the world in blood-red light. "You heard the lady," Jamie said. "Get on your knees." "Silas." Silas stiffened. His hand moved toward the inside of his coat. "I would not do that," Jamie warned. The standoff held. The sun sank lower. The reckoning had arrived. "Kill them!" The command tore out of Silas's throat, ragged and desperate. It was not the voice of a preacher. It was the voice of a cornered animal. The gunman beside Silas, a man named weary-faced man named Pete, hesitated for a fraction of a second. his eyes darting between his employer and the man approaching with death in his stride. But panic is a contagious thing. Pete raised his rifle, the barrel wavering in the wind. "Get down!" Jamie roared. He threw himself to the left, tackling Ellen. They hit the hard, shale-covered ground just as the air split with the crack of gunfire. A bullet whined off the granite shelf where they had been standing a moment before, sending a spray of stone splinters stinging into their faces. They scrambled behind a large, flat boulder that jutted out of the earth like a shield. Another shot rang out, chipping the top of their cover. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, a chaotic, deafening thunder that drowned out the wind. "Stay low," Jamie ordered, his voice tight. He thumbed the hammer of his Colt, his eyes scanning the edge of the rock. "He is panicking! He is firing wild!" Ellen was huddled against the cold stone, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had never been in a gunfight. The noise was more physical than she expected, a percussion that she felt in her teeth. Dust choked the air, tasting of copper and sulfur. "Here," Jamie said, pressing a heavy revolver into her hand. It was his backup piece, a smaller caliber weapon he kept in his saddlebag. "If anyone comes around that side, you pull the trigger. You do not aim, you just point and pull." Ellen gripped the cold steel. Her hands were shaking so badly she thought she might drop it. She looked at the gun, then at Jamie, then at the sliver of sky visible above the rock. "They burned my house," she thought. "They tried to kill me in my bed." The fear suddenly crystallized into something cold and sharp. "I am not going to die here," she whispered. Movement flashed to her right. Pete was trying to flank them, scuttling through the brush, thinking them pinned. Ellen didn't think. She didn't weigh the moral weight of the act. She turned, leveled the heavy pistol, and fired. The recoil was a shock, jerking her arm back, but her eyes remained open. "Ah!" The cry came from the brush. She hadn't hit him squarely. The bullet had torn through the meat of his upper arm, or perhaps grazed his ribs. But it was enough. Pete dropped his rifle, clutching his side, and scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the loose rock. "I am done!" Pete screamed, his voice cracking. "I am not dying for this. Silas, I am not dying for you!" He turned and ran, stumbling down the slope toward the horses, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. Jamie looked at Ellen. There was no shock in his eyes, only a fierce, grim approval. "Stay here," he said. Then Jamie moved. He didn't run. He flowed. He rose from behind the rock with a lethal calm that made Ellen's breath catch. This was not the gentleman who had washed soot from her face. This was the soldier. This was the survivor of 1,000 brutal nights. The second henchman. Thomas, who was already nursing a wounded shoulder, fumbled for his pistol with his good hand. He saw Jamie coming, a dark shape moving through the twilight shadows, and his nerve broke. He got the gun up, but Jamie was already there. Jamie didn't fire. He stepped inside the man's guard, his movement a blur. He caught Thomas's wrist, twisting it with a sickening crunch. Thomas screamed, dropping the gun. Jamie struck him, a short, brutal blow with the butt of his revolver across the temple. It was efficient, devoid of anger, simply a mechanic removing an obstacle. Thomas crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the dirt. Now, it was just the two of them. And Silas stood at the edge of the precipice, the wind whipping the tails of his black coat. He looked smaller now, stripped of his enforcers. He held a small, nickel-plated revolver in his hand, but he wasn't raising it. He was staring at Jamie with wide, disbelief-filled eyes. Jamie walked toward him. He didn't hurry. His boots crunched softly on the gravel. He walked with the heavy, uneven gait of a man carrying 5 years of pain in his left leg, and every step was a promise kept. "Stay back," Silas hissed, raising the gun. His hand trembled. Jamie didn't stop. He walked right up to the barrel of the gun. He moved with such terrified certainty that Silas flinched, stepping back until his heels were inches from the drop. With a sudden, violent motion, Jamie lashed out. He knocked the gun from Silas's hand. It clattered across the stone and spun off the edge, falling silently into the void below. Jamie stepped in. He grabbed the lapels of Silas's fine black coat and slammed him backward. Silas stumbled, flailing, but Jamie yanked him forward again, pulling him away from the cliff edge only to shove him down onto a flat shelf of rock. Jamie loomed over him. He leveled his Colt at Silas's chest. The muzzle was steady as a mountain. "Please," Silas gasped, the words strangled. "Now, hold on. Let us be reasonable men." "Reasonable?" Jamie asked softly. "Was it reasonable when you had 4 men hold me down? Was it reasonable this morning when you lit that match?" Silas scrambled backward on his elbows, sweat streaming down his face, cutting tracks through the dust. I was protecting the town. You have to understand. Jamie, it is my burden. I have to make the hard choices." "You did it for hate," Jamie said, "and you did it for greed." Silas's eyes darted around, looking for a way out, looking for a weapon. Finding none, he tried to arm himself with the only thing he had left, his prejudice. "You think they will believe you?" Silas sneered, his voice gaining a sudden, vicious strength. "You are nothing but a half-breed drifter. You are a mongrel dog I kicked off my ranch. And her?" He flicked his eyes toward Ellen, who was emerging from behind the boulder. "She is a ruined woman, a harlot living in the dirt. My word is law in this valley. You shoot me, and you will hang, both of you." The words cut deep. They were the same words that had followed Jamie his whole life. Mongrel, less than, nothing. A red haze formed at the edges of Jamie's vision. His finger tightened on the trigger. The metal bit into his skin. It would be so easy. Just one squeeze, just one loud noise, and the voice that had haunted his nightmares for 5 years would be silenced forever. The urge was physical, a burning need in his gut to erase this man from the earth. "Jamie," the voice was soft, but it cut through the roaring in his ears. Ellen stepped between them. She didn't look at Silas. She put her back to the man who had burned her home, placing herself directly in the line of fire, directly in front of Jamie. She reached out and placed her hand over his. Her fingers were cold, but her touch was steady. "Look at me," she said. Jamie's eyes were wild, dilated with adrenaline and rage. He blinked, trying to focus on her face. "Move, Ellen. He deserves it." "I know he does," Ellen said. Her voice was low, firm, anchoring him. "He deserves to die, but if you kill him now, while he is unarmed, while he is on the ground, you make him a martyr. The town will say he died defending them from a savage. They will build a statue to him. Jamie, and they will hunt us down like animals. I do not care," Jamie snarled, though the gun lowered a fraction of an inch. "I care," Ellen said. Tears shone in her eyes, catching the last of the red sunlight, but she didn't blink. "I lost my home today. I lost my father's letters. I will not lose you to a hangman's noose because of him. He has taken enough from us." She squeezed his hand. "Do not give him the satisfaction of turning you into the monster he says you are. You are better than him. Jamie, you are the man who pulled me from the fire. Be that man." Jamie stared at her. He felt the trembling in his arm, the war between the violence in his blood and the hope in her eyes, in her. He looked at Silas, cowering in the dirt, and then back at Ellen. He let out a long, shuddering breath. The red haze receded, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. "Get up," Jamie said to Silas, stepping around Ellen but keeping his gun trained. Silas blinked, confused by the reprieve. He started to scramble to his feet, a smirk beginning to form on his lips. "You see? You know I am right. You know you cannot touch—" "I said on your knees," Jamie roared. He fired a single shot into the ground, inches from Silas's left boot. The crack was deafening. Dust and rock chips sprayed onto Silas's trousers. Silas shrieked and dropped back to his knees, throwing his hands up. The arrogance shattered like cheap glass. "Do not shoot! Oh God, do not shoot!" "Beg," Jamie said. His voice was deathly quiet. I, Silas stammered. He looked around, desperate. "I will give you money. I have gold in the safe at the ranch. $500. Take it and go." I do not want your money, Jamie said. I want the truth. Say it. Say what you did. Silas swallowed, his throat working. There was a fire. No, Ellen said, stepping forward. Her voice was like a whip. You set the fire. Say it. I set the fire, Silas whispered, looking at the ground. Louder, Jamie commanded, stepping closer. I set the fire, Silas cried out, his voice cracking. Tears of humiliation and fear streamed down his face. I ordered the men to pour the kerosene. I struck the match. Why? Ellen asked. Because, Silas sobbed. Because I wanted the water rights. Because the town. They listened to me. And you? And me, Jamie prodded. Tell her about the ranch. Tell her about 5 years ago. Silas looked up at Jamie, his face a mask of misery. I had you beaten. I told them to break your legs. Why? Jamie asked. Because you stood up to me. Silas wept. Because you shamed me in front of my men. I wanted to break you. The confession hung in the air, heavy and ugly. The great Silas Crow, the lay preacher, the pillar of Red Hollow, was kneeling in the dirt, snot running from his nose, begging for his life from a drifter and a homesteader. Please, Silas moaned, clasping his hands together. Please, have mercy. I am a sinful man. I will repent. Just let me go. Jamie looked down at him with profound disgust. The desire to kill him was gone, replaced by a revulsion so deep it made his stomach turn. This man was not a monster. He was just a small, greedy coward wrapped in a black coat. Mercy, Jamie repeated, tasting the word. You ask for mercy? Did you show mercy to the boy you whipped? Did you show mercy when you blocked the door of a burning cabin? Please, Silas whispered, putting his forehead in the dust. Ellen stepped forward. She looked down at the man who had destroyed her life. She could have kicked him. She could have told Jamie to pull the trigger. We are taking him back, Ellen said. To the sheriff? Jamie asked. To the town, Ellen said. Sheriff Briggs wanted witnesses? He will have the whole town. We are going to walk him down Main Street like this. We are going to show them exactly what their leader is. Jamie nodded slowly. Binding. He holstered his gun and pulled a length of rawhide rope from his belt. He grabbed Silas's wrists and wrenched them behind his back. Silas didn't fight. He was broken. Jamie tied the knots tight, biting into the flesh. He went over to Thomas, who was groaning as he regained consciousness, and dragged him up. He tied Thomas's hands to his saddle horn. Walk, Jamie ordered Silas. They began the descent. The sun had set, leaving the sky a bruised purple. The wind was cold now, biting through their clothes. Silas stumbled as they walked, his head hanging low. He mumbled prayers under his breath, but they sounded hollow. When they reached the valley floor, the moon was rising, casting long, silvery shadows across the sagebrush. They had to pass the Ward homestead to get to the road. Stop, Ellen said when they reached the creek. She dismounted from the bay horse. She walked over to Silas and grabbed the lapel of his coat, forcing him to turn. Look, she commanded. The ruins of the cabin were a black scar against the moonlight. The chimney stood like a broken finger. A faint wisp of smoke still curled from the cellar hole. The smell of wet ash was overpowering. Look at your work, Brother Crow, Ellen said. Her voice was devoid of fear now. Does it look holy to you? Does this look like the work of God? Silas squeezed his eyes shut. I... Open them, Jamie growled from the saddle. Silas opened his eyes. He looked at the devastation. He saw the remains of the garden, trampled by his men's horses. He saw the blackened stones. His shoulders sagged, his posture collapsing inward. He looked old. He looked empty. No, Silas whispered. Remember this, Ellen said. Every time you close your eyes in your cell, I want you to see this. She turned away and mounted the horse behind Jamie. Let us go. Red Hollow was quiet when they arrived. The saloon was open, yellow lights spilling onto the dusty street. A few men were sitting on the porch of the hotel. The sound of the horse and the stumbling prisoners drew attention. One by one, people stepped out of the shadows. It was a strange procession. A cowboy and a woman in a ruined dress riding double on a tired horse, dragging two bound men behind them. Is that Silas?" someone whispered. "Good God, he is tied up." Jamie rode straight to the sheriff's office. He didn't stop until he was in the center of the street, under the light of the gas lamp that hung outside the jail. "Sheriff Briggs," Jamie shouted. "Get out here." The door opened. Briggs stepped out, buttoning his suspenders. He blinked at the scene. He saw Silas Crow, the town patriarch, covered in dust, hands bound, head bowed in shame. He saw Thomas battered and bloody. "What in the name of—" Briggs started. "Here's your arsonist," Jamie said, his voice carrying to the crowd that was gathering. "And here's your witness. He confessed. He admitted to the fire. He admitted to the assault." A murmur went through the crowd. Some of Silas's loyal followers pushed to the front. "You cannot do this," a man shouted. "Untie him. That is a man of God." "Ask him," Ellen shouted back. She slid off the horse and stood in the street. Illuminated by the lamp, she pointed at Silas. "Ask him what he did." The crowd turned to Silas. "Tell them." "Silas," Jamie said, his hand resting on his gun. Silas looked up. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, his congregation. He saw the doubt in their eyes. He saw the judgment. Silas croaked. He licked his dry lips. I sinned. I burned the cabin." The silence that followed was absolute. The man who had shouted for his release stepped back, looking sick. Sheriff Briggs looked at Silas, then at the crowd. He knew the wind had changed. The power had shifted. If he let Silas go now, there would be a riot, or a lynching, or worse. "Silas Crow," Briggs said, his voice heavy, "I am placing you under arrest." He stepped off the boardwalk and took Silas by the arm. He didn't handle him gently this time. He shoved him toward the jail door. As Silas passed Ellen, he didn't look at her. He stared at the ground, a ghost of a man. The heavy iron door slammed shut. The sound of the key turning in the lock was the loudest sound Ellen had ever heard. The crowd stood there for a long time. They looked at Ellen and Jamie. There was no mockery now. There was shock, and there was a strange, grudging respect. They had seen the impossible. They had seen the untouchable man brought low. Jamie dismounted. He stood beside Ellen. He put his arm around her, and this time, no one sneered. No one made a comment. "Come on," Jamie said softly. "Let us get off the street." They walked to the saloon. The bartender, a man who had never spoken a kind word to Jamie in his life, looked at them as they entered. He saw the exhaustion etched into their faces. He saw the way they leaned on each other. "We need a room," Jamie said, "and a bath, and a bottle of whiskey." The bartender nodded. "Upstairs, room 4. It is on the house." The room was small. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, and the window looked out over the alley. The air smelled of stale tobacco and cheap lavender water. The bed sagged in the middle. To Ellen, it looked like a palace. Jamie locked the door. He threw the bolt home with a solid thunk. He turned to her. They stood there in the dim light of the single oil lamp. The adrenaline was crashing out of them now, leaving them shaking and raw. Ellen looked at her hands. They were black with soot and gunpowder. She looked at Jamie. His shirt was torn, his face streaked with dust and dried blood from a scratch on his cheek. "We did it," she whispered. "We did it," Jamie said. He walked over to her. He didn't embrace her immediately. He reached out and took her trembling hands in his. He lifted them to his lips and kissed her knuckles, right over the soot and the grime. A sob broke from Ellen's chest. It wasn't a sob of grief this time. It was relief. It was the release of a day that had lasted 100 years. She fell into him. Jamie caught her, wrapping his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. They held each other in the center of the cheap room, swaying slightly. "I thought," Ellen choked out, "I thought when you had the gun on him, I thought you were going to do it." "I wanted to," Jamie admitted, his voice muffled against her neck. "God, I wanted to, But then you touched my hand." He pulled back to look at her. His eyes were soft, the gold flecks shining in the lamplight. "You saved me, Ellen. If I had pulled that trigger, I would have lost myself. You brought me back. You saved me first," she said, reaching up to touch the scar on his eyebrow. They stood there, alive. The town outside was quiet. The wind rattled the window pane, but it couldn't get in. They were safe. Slowly, the terror began to fade, replaced by the crushing weight of exhaustion, and beneath that, the rekindling of the fire they had started in the canyon. Jamie's hand moved to her waist. Ellen's fingers tangled in the collar of his shirt. "I promised you," Jamie whispered. "A room with a lock, and no one hunting us." Ellen finished. She leaned up and kissed him. It was a slow, weary, desperate kiss. It tasted of dust and survival. It was the taste of a future that they had wrestled from the jaws of the dawn. They were battered, they were homeless, and they were outcasts. But as Jamie lowered her onto the lumpy mattress and pulled the quilt over them, Ellen knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not alone, and for the first time in her life, the dark was not something to fear. It was just the night, and the night belonged to them. The oil lamp on the bedside table cast a flickering, amber circle of light against the peeling wallpaper. The room smelled of dust, old pine, and the faint, lingering scent of cheap lavender water used to mask the odor of tobacco smoke. But to Ellen and Jamie, it smelled like a sanctuary. They sat on the edge of the narrow iron bed, their boots resting on the scarred floorboards. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the canyon, the shootout, and the confrontation in the street had finally drained away, leaving a sudden, hollow silence in its wake. Ellen looked at her hands, resting in her lap. They were unrecognizable. The knuckles were gray with soot, the nails broken, the skin trembling with a fine, persistent tremor she could not still. She looked at Jamie. He sat with his elbows on his knees, head bowed. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing a dark bruise blossoming on his skin, and dried blood flaked on his cheek where a stone splinter had grazed him. They were ruins, both of them, battered vessels that had somehow carried each other through the fire. "We are alive," Jamie said softly. He did not look up, but his hand moved across the coverlet, seeking hers. Ellen watched his hand approach. It was a large hand, scarred and brown, the knuckles swollen from the fight. She remembered the violence of those hands earlier in the day, disarming a gunman with brutal efficiency. And she remembered the gentleness of those same hands washing her face by the creek. She reached out and met him halfway. Her fingers traced the white ridges of scar tissue on his knuckles, reading the history of his pain like braille. "I did not think we would be," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "When the roof came down, I thought that was the end of the story." Jamie turned his head to look at her. The lamplight caught the gold flecks in his dark eyes, illuminating a raw, unguarded vulnerability she had never seen there before. He reached up and brushed his thumb over a purple bruise forming near her collarbone, a mark left by the recoil of the heavy pistol she had fired. "I would not let it end," he said. "Not like that." The touch sent a shiver through her, but it was not from cold. It was a spark jumping across the gap between them, igniting the dry kindling of her loneliness. "I have been alone for so long," Ellen whispered. The confession tumbled out before she could stop it. "Even when my father was alive, there was a distance, and after, God, Jamie, I forgot what it felt like to be seen, to be wanted without being judged as a curiosity or a target." Jamie's hand moved from her collarbone to cup her cheek. His palm was rough, warm, and solid. "I never let myself want a home," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A home is something they can take from you. They took my family's land when I was a boy. They took my dignity at the Crow Ranch. I learned to live in the saddle because you cannot burn a saddle down. But today," he paused, searching her eyes. "Today, watching you stand in that street and point your finger at Silas, I realized I was wrong. Home is not a roof. It is not a piece of ground." He leaned in, the movement slow and inevitable as the tide. It is the person standing beside you in the fire, he finished. He kissed her. It was not like the kiss in the canyon, desperate and frantic. This was slow. It was unhurried. It was a question asked and answered in the soft pressure of lips against lips. Ellen let out a long, shuddering breath, her eyes fluttering shut. Her fingers curled into the thick, dusty hair at the nape of his neck. She pulled him closer, needing the weight of him to anchor her to the earth. Jamie's hands moved with a reverence that made her chest ache. He cradled her face as if she were made of fine porcelain, not flesh and blood that had crawled through smoke and dirt. His hand slid down her neck, over her shoulders, and rested at her waist, pulling her gently until their bodies were pressed together from chest to knee. The desire that rose between them was powerful, a deep, tidal pull, but it was edged with fear. They were both scarred people, unused to tenderness. To open oneself this wide was to invite a new kind of wound. "Are you sure?" Jamie whispered against her mouth. "We can stop. You have been through hell today." "I am still in hell if I am alone," Ellen replied. She pulled back slightly to look at him, her hands moving to the buttons of his torn shirt. "Make me forget the fire, Jamie, please." They lay back on the lumpy mattress. The quilt pulled up to shut out the shadows of the room. The undressing was a slow, clumsy dance of trembling fingers and soft murmurs. There was a nervous laughter from Ellen when a button on her cuff refused to give way, followed by Jamie's whispered reassurance as he worked it free with patient fingers. When skin finally touched skin, it was a revelation. He was hard muscle and old scars. She was soft curves and hidden strength. Every touch was a negotiation of trust. Jamie kissed the soot stain on her shoulder. Ellen kissed the jagged line of the old break on his shin. They moved together in the dim light, their bodies finding a shared language that had no need for words. It was a language that said, "We are still here. We are not just what was done to us. We are alive, and we are warm, and we belong to each other." In the climax of the night, the grief and the terror were transmuted into something else, a fierce, burning affirmation of life. They clung to each other as if the world outside might dissolve if they let go. And for a few hours, in that small, rented room above a saloon, they built a fortress that no fire could touch. The sun rose the next morning, indifferent to the dramas of Red Hollow. But the town itself had changed. The air was thick with tension, buzzing like a disturbed hornet nest. Silas Crow was in the jail cell, a fact that seemed to violate the natural laws of the valley. Ellen and Jamie emerged from the hotel shortly after dawn. They walked down the stairs and onto the boardwalk, moving as a unit. Jamie walked on the outside, placing his body between Ellen and the street, his hand resting casually near his hip. The stares were immediate. "Look at them," a woman hissed from the doorway of the bakery. Bold as brass, after ruining a good man. "I heard he forced Silas to confess at gunpoint," a man muttered to his neighbor. "A confession under duress is no confession at all." Ellen kept her head high, though her stomach churned. She wore a plain gray dress she had purchased from the mercantile with the last of the money in Jamie's pocket, her nightdress having been discarded in the hotel room's wood stove. It was ill-fitting and stiff, but it was clean. They walked to the livery to check on the horses. As they passed the butcher shop, the door opened. Mr. Holloway, the man who had overcharged her for pork just the day before, stepped out with a broom. He saw them coming. He paused, his eyes shifting from Ellen to Jamie. He looked at the bruises on Ellen's face, the defiance in her posture. He cleared his throat. "Miss Ward." Ellen braced herself for an insult. "Mr. Holloway." The butcher looked down at his broom, then back at her. I heard about the cabin. And the letters." He shifted his weight awkwardly. "My mother lost her things in a flood back in '62. It is a hard thing to lose your history." He reached into his apron pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped parcel. He held it out. "Some beef jerky," he mumbled. "For the trail, on the house." Ellen stared at the package. It was a small thing, a few ounces of dried meat, but it felt heavy with significance. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. Holloway nodded once, sharp and quick, and went back to sweeping. It was not a revolution, but it was a crack in the wall. Over the next 3 days, as they waited for the circuit judge to arrive, the town divided. The churchgoers, led by Silas's weeping wife, maintained that Silas was a martyr, tested by God. But in the saloons and the back alleys, other stories began to trickle out. A farmer spoke of water rights stolen. A widow whispered about a loan that never seemed to be paid off. The fear that Silas had wielded like a cudgel was broken, and in its absence, the truth began to bloom like weeds in a garden. Sheriff Briggs wired for the judge, his telegram urgent. He knew that Red Hollow was a powder keg, and Silas Crow was the match. "You two should stay close," Briggs told them, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I have deputized 2 men to watch the jail, but emotions are running high. There is talk of a breakout." "Let them try," Jamie said, his voice cold. "We are not leaving," Ellen added. "Not until he stands before a judge." But in the quiet hours of the evening, sitting on the porch of the hotel, they spoke of the future. "We cannot stay here," Ellen said, watching the sunset bleed over the ridges. "Even if he is convicted, half this town will always hate us for exposing him, and the other half will just pity us." "I know a valley," Jamie said, staring west. 2 days' ride from here. High country. Good water. The soil is rocky, but it will grow corn if you ask it nicely. And the timber is thick." "Is it quiet?" Ellen asked. "It is quiet," Jamie promised. "Just the wind and the elk. No preachers, no ladies' circles." "I'm afraid," Ellen admitted, turning to him. "I am afraid to build again. I am afraid to put another log on another foundation and watch it burn." Jamie took her hand, interlacing their fingers. "If it burns, we build it again, but it won't burn. I will stand in the doorway. Ellen, I will stand between you and the fire, or the wind, or the devil himself." "And who stands for you?" she asked softly. "You do," Jamie said. "You already did. The circuit judge, a man named Thaddeus Holt, arrived on a dusty buckboard 4 days later. He was a man carved from granite, with a beard like steel wool and eyes that had seen every variation of human cruelty the frontier could offer. He had no patience for theatrics and even less for delay. He set up court in the town hall, a drafty building that smelled of sawdust and lemon oil. The room was packed. Every soul in Red Hollow seemed to have squeezed onto the benches, creating a sea of murmuring voices and shifting bodies. Silas Crow sat at the defendant's table. He had shaved, and someone had brought him a fresh black coat, but he looked diminished. The arrogance that had inflated him was gone, punctured by the memory of his own begging. He sat hunched, staring at his hands. Ellen was the first to testify. She took the stand, placing her hand on the Bible, a Bible borrowed from the church, not her father's, which was now ash. "Tell the court what happened on the morning of the 12th, Judge Holt commanded. Ellen looked out at the crowd. She saw Mrs. Crow glaring at her. She saw the butcher nodding encouragingly. She saw Jamie, sitting in the front row, his hat in his hand, his eyes fixed on her with absolute pride. She took a breath. "I was asleep," she began. Her voice shook, but she forced it to settle. "I woke up to the smell of smoke. The room was already orange." She told the story simply. She didn't embellish. She spoke of the kerosene smell, the blocked door, the scramble through the window. She spoke of the items she had lost. "It wasn't just a house," she told the judge. "It was my father's legacy. It was every memory I had of my mother, Mr. Crow didn't just burn wood. He tried to erase me." When Jamie took the stand, the tension in the room spiked. "You have a history with the defendant?" the prosecutor asked. "I worked his ranch 5 years ago," Jamie said. His voice was a low rumble. "I saw him whip a 12-year-old boy for losing a saddle. When I tried to stop him, he had 4 men hold me down and break my leg." "Objection!" Silas's lawyer shouted. "Irrelevant. It goes to character," Judge Holt ruled, waving his hand. "Continue. Mr. Cortez." "He watched," Jamie said, looking directly at Silas. "He stood there and watched my bones break, and he looked like he was checking a tally sheet. He enjoys the pain of others. Your Honor, he calls it righteousness. But it is just cruelty. Silas was called to the stand. He tried to muster his old fire. He straightened his coat and looked at the jury with a practiced, benevolent smile. "I am a man of God," Silas proclaimed. "I have only ever sought to keep this valley pure. These two, they are agents of chaos. I admit, I may have been zealous, but arson, assault, I was merely encouraging a relocation." "With kerosene?" Judge Holt asked, peering over his spectacles. "It was a symbol," Silas blustered. "A biblical cleansing." "And begging for your life in the dirt?" the prosecutor asked. "Was that biblical?" Silas turned red. "I was under duress. That man had a gun to my chest." "We have the testimony of your own associate, Mr. Thomas," the prosecutor noted. "He says you ordered the fire. He says you laughed when it caught." The trial lasted 2 days. In the end, it wasn't the law that convicted Silas Crow. It was the weight of his own hypocrisy. The jury, comprised of men who had feared him for years, finally saw him for what he was, a small man casting a large shadow. "The prisoner will rise," Judge Holt intoned. Silas stood up, his legs trembling. "Silas Crow, on the charge of arson. I find you guilty. On the charge of assault, guilty." A gasp went through the room. "This is not a hanging offense," the judge continued. "Though perhaps it should be, but we do not hang men for burning wood in this territory. However, you are a danger to this community. I sentence you to 10 years of hard labor at the territorial prison in Yuma. You will break rocks, Mr. Crow. You will sweat, and perhaps, in the silence of the stone, you will find the humility you so sorely lack." Silas collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. The gavel banged, sharp and final. The departure from Red Hollow was quiet. Ellen and Jamie packed their few belongings onto 2 horses, Jamie's bay and a sturdy mare they had purchased for Ellen. They had the deed to a new plot of land in their saddlebags, bought with the restitution money the court had seized from Silas's accounts. They rode down Main Street one last time. People stopped to watch them go. There were no cheers, but there were no jeers either. A few men had tipped their hats. Sheriff Briggs stood on the porch of his office, watching them. "You take care now," Briggs called out, awkwardly. Jamie nodded. "Try to keep the peace. Sheriff, town is changing," Briggs muttered to himself. "Whether I like it or not." Ellen didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the western horizon, where the mountains rose purple and majestic against the sky. She felt a strange lightness in her chest. The fear that had dogged her for years was gone, left behind in the ashes of the cabin and the dust of the courtroom. They rode for 2 days, climbing higher into the cooler air of the mountains. The landscape changed from sagebrush desert to pine forest. The air smelled of resin and damp earth. They found the valley Jamie had promised. It was a bowl of green tucked between 2 granite peaks, a creek, clear as glass and cold as snowmelt. Cut through the center, there were apple trees growing wild near the water, their branches heavy with small, green fruit. "Here," Jamie said, pulling his horse up. "It is beautiful," Ellen whispered. They set to work. It was hard labor, brutal and exhausting, but it was a different kind of work than Ellen had known before. It wasn't survival work. It was building work. They felled trees, their axes ringing in the crisp air. They stripped bark and notched logs. They hauled stones from the creek bed to build a foundation. They lived in a canvas tent while they built, sleeping wrapped in each other's arms, waking to the sound of bird song and the wind in the pines. Weeks turned into months. The walls rose, the roof was framed. They chinked the gaps with mud and moss. One morning, late in the autumn, they stood on the unfinished porch of their new home. The sun was just cresting the eastern peaks, spilling a flood of golden light into the valley. The frost on the grass glittered like diamonds. The air was cold and sharp, burning pleasantly in the lungs. Ellen stood wrapped in a heavy wool shawl, a new one, bought in the city where the trial was held. She watched the light touch the tops of the hills. She felt strong. Her hands were calloused again, her skin brown from the sun, but the tremor was gone. Jamie stepped up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his cheek rough against hers. "Morning," he murmured. "Morning?" she replied, leaning into him. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the day begin. "The apples will be ready to pick soon," Ellen said softly. "We should dry some for winter." "We will plant more in the spring," Jamie said. "A whole orchard, right down by the water. They will be here long after we are gone." "And a garden," Ellen added. "I want to try potatoes in that sandy patch." "We will need room," Jamie said, his hand resting flat on her stomach. "If we are going to fill this valley." Ellen turned in his arms to face him. She looked at the scars on his face, the gray hairs beginning to show at his temples. She saw the man who had ridden into hell for her. "We have time," she said. "We have all the time in the world." She looked past him, up at the vast, open sky. She thought of the dawn her cabin burned. She remembered the smoke, the choking fear, the sight of Silas on his horse. It felt like a nightmare from another life. She looked back at Jamie. "You made him beg," she whispered, a small smile playing on her lips. "I did," Jamie said, his eyes serious. "But you made him pay." He kissed the side of her neck, just below her ear. "As long as I can hold a hammer," he murmured against her skin. "As long as I can hold a rifle, and as long as I can hold you, no man will ever make you beg for mercy again. Ellen, not in this world." "I know," she said. The sun cleared the peaks, bathing the porch in warmth. They stood side by side, scars visible and hearts still tender, watching the light banish the shadows from their valley. What was born in fire and violence had become a love that refused to bow. They had been burned out, hunted and judged, but they had chosen each other again and again. And here, in this high, wild place, at the break of a new day, they had finally found their home. Thank you, dear friends, for riding along on this journey with Ellen and Jamie. It is a long trail from the ashes of a cabin to the peace of a mountain valley, and I am grateful you walked it with me. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you out on the range, or listening from the comfort of the city? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the story. Did Silas get what he deserved? Would you have pulled the trigger? If you enjoyed this tale of the American West, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. There are many more stories to tell, of outlaws and lawmen, of heartbreaks and horizons. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the sunset.